think about this too. If this does get fully federal, why does Common Core matter? Okay, and I've heard teachers say this. I've been teaching for 35 years. Every bad idea, they come and they go. Well, what's the difference? Well, what was it that killed No Child Left Behind? It was the fact that No Child Left Behind allowed enough state and local control so that working teachers and moms and dads could see it wasn't working. No Child Left Behind was killed from the ground up, a groundswell. The outcry against it in state and local schools was so bad that you had to get rid of it. Here's one of the great ironies. Not only when Obama created Race to the Top, not only did he offer states free money simply for adopting Common Core, sight unseen, he also granted every state in the union who took the money a waiver from No Child Left Behind. Think about that for a second. And yet, Common Core is nothing but No Child Left Behind on steroids. No one wants to talk about that either. The very things that even the defenders of Common Core hated about No Child Left Behind, suddenly it doesn't bother them about Common Core. And what's the difference between what's the only serious difference between No Child Left Behind and Common Core? It's that the power that it will ultimately invest at the federal level. Right now, and all throughout the No Child Left Behind era, you could go to your teacher, if there's a bad lesson plan for the day or a book that you objected to or some sexuality discussion you want your kids in, you can go to your teacher, opt out of it. How do you opt out when it's all part of standards now? When everything is tied to a standard and it's going to be tested, you can't opt out anymore. Right now, you still have the ability to talk to your teachers, to have an impact in your school. But when this thing, if it ever does get fully federalized, you know what's going to happen when you go talk to your principal. He's going to give you the 1-800-ARNIE Duncan line. And you're going to spend 3 weeks on hold in Washington. Who are you going to talk to? See, the real danger of Common Core and why, and if you stop Common Core, because you're going to have to do it, moms and dads, grandmas and grandpas, because there's no will in the legislature, because there's no will in the governor's office, and certainly no will in the DPI, you're going to have to stop it. And if you do stop it, you're still going to have, because all Common Core is the really ugly tumor that you can see, because all this stuff has been there. You remember back in 1996 when we had Hillary Care, and everybody laughed, and Saturday Night Live did skits about it? Well, here we are 10 years later, 12 years later, no one's laughing. And that, unfortunately, is how things have gone with education in this country for the last 40 years. Every time one of these large government interventionist programs like No Child Left Behind, every time they fail, they never think about going the other way. They never think about increasing autonomy or increasing flexibility. They always change the name and roll it out again. And so I promise you, if you kill Common Core, in 5 years, someone's going to put forth happy, happy, joy, joy education. It's going to be the same stuff. That's unfortunate. That's the reality. Impossible to do. Oh, last thing I want you to think about in terms of what's going on with this. If this gets fully, I've lived in 7 states, taught in 7 states. I have never lived in a state whose real estate and property taxes were as high as this one. It's shocking. But, thanks. But the saving grace of that, I suppose, if there is one, is that theoretically a lot of that money goes to the school kids, right? Most of it goes to the schools. What's going to happen when the whole thing gets run through Washington? Do you think that money's going to get to stay in your state? You think your taxes are going to go down? And do you think that money, all that extra money that compared to other states you're paying, you think that gets to stay in Wisconsin? What's going to happen at the federal government? Because Wisconsin has a decent, always has, a very decent education. That's why it's not a teacher problem. A very decent educational infrastructure. But states like Mississippi and Oklahoma and Louisiana don't. So you're paying all this extra money that those states aren't. Your kids will do better than kids in Mississippi and Oklahoma and Louisiana. Even with the standard, you watch. Because that's what happened with No Child Left Behind. That's the other big lie about outcome-based education. We had No Child Left Behind for over a decade, and states were all over the map. It didn't standardize anything. So when your money, your kids will do better. Your kids won't do well, because it's Common Core. But your kids will do better than kids in states like Mississippi and Louisiana. And then what's going to happen to all that extra money? They're going to have to redistribute it, aren't they? Right? You see, and then what purpose do local and state school boards serve? Nothing. Think about I keep mentioning Obamacare. Think about an Obamacare. You sign up for these state exchanges. We don't have one in Wisconsin, but in the states that have these state exchanges, does the state of Michigan have the right to offer you a program that's not Common Core? No. What Michigan does is administer the federal program. Just like what's going to happen with, as these two lawyers say. What's left of state and local school boards is just going to be, the entire mission will be to implement the national federal program. It can't be any other way. Impossible to deal with. This is pretty shocking. So after this basically group of 5 wrote the standards behind closed doors, they got together a validation committee. They brought 29 people in. There were some education teachers on it. There were some elementary and middle school types on it. And there were some activists on the committee. They brought in 29 people to validate the standards. In other words, the job of this committee was to look at math and English and give it the seal of approval. Well, they brought in 1 English language arts specialist and 1 math specialist, and that was it. The English language arts specialist was a woman by the name of Sandy Stotsky, testified in Wisconsin. You can watch it online. For an hour and a half she testified. Shockingly eye-opening. And by the way, the 2 people I'm about to introduce you to, Sandy Stotsky was the English language arts expert, and Professor Jim Milgram of Stanford University is the math specialist. Milgram is one of only about 6 mathematicians with the in this country with the math competency to theoretically construct a national math standard. These 2 were the experts. Both voted no. Both said that these standards were absolutely inadequate, that in both reading and math they would put our kids 2 years further behind at least from the rest of the country. And again, if you type in Stotsky or Milgram, or you go to the website I'll show you at the end, you can watch their, don't listen to me, watch their testimony. Free of charge. They told the state this. And Stotsky and Milgram know more about Common Core than anybody in the whole state of Wisconsin because they were in the room. Some of their experiences. The facilitators, the people who organized the validation committee, the facilitators for the Common Core Validation Committee meeting, they were virtually impossible to deal with, wrote James Milgram, Stanford University professor who sat on the committee, in an email obtained by School Reform News. Quote, Milgram wrote, the facilitators were emphatically trying to not let us act according to our charter, but simply they wanted us to sign or not sign a final approval letter when the charter said we had final say over the standards themselves and could revise them. Milgram and Stotsky got on the committee because they were told if they were deficient they could fix them, and they weren't allowed to do it. Not only that, they voted no and convinced 5 other people to vote no. And conveniently, the entire no voting block was written out of the final report of the validation committee. 5 of the 29 validation committee members refused to sign off on Common Core. The validation committee's final report does not mention their objections. Its author, the person who wrote the report, later told Stotsky that he had never received any written objections from them. She said, although she and several others had sent them. He would have included them, he told her. When government agencies solicit public comments on proposed policies, standard procedure is for the agency to publish all comments. That did not happen with Common Core. Nowhere in the Common Core Validation Committee are Milgram or Stotsky even mentioned. These, by the way, were the 2 chief experts to validate math and English. Right? Again, even if you think, we know this, right? That a good teacher can make something out of the worst curriculum. And a poor teacher can screw up even the best curriculum. I have no doubt. I've seen, were there certain things in No Child Left Behind that had some merit? Sure. But is that enough to keep it? And then you got this, right? Again, even if you think Common Core may have some usefulness, how can you? And you know what they're saying? You hear what they're saying, right? What are they saying here in Kewaskum about people who just want to learn more about this? What are they saying to you? This is all just right-wing fringe. It's in your schools. They're your kids. And here you are a year into it, and now you're asking questions? And simply by asking questions, you're being divisive? I want to have a dialogue. I want to hear from them. I've told them so many times, I will sit and listen. I won't say a word. You don't have to worry about me interrupting. They won't do it. They will not do it. And again, whatever you think about the potential merits of Common Core, how can you put faith in a process like this? All right, so there's the validation committee, right? So what do we know, right? Common Core validation. This is an article by two actually revered Catholic scholars about the nature of Common Core, McGroarty and Robbins. They published a national paper on this. Common Core Validation Committee, Sandra Stotsky, perhaps the nation's, that's why they invited her, perhaps the nation's premier expert on English language art standards for kids, refused to sign off on the Common Core standards because they, quote, weaken the basis of literary and cultural knowledge needed for authentic college coursework, unquote. And the math standards are similarly deficient. Stanford math professor James Milgram concluded that, quote, it is almost a joke to think that students who master the Common Core would be ready for math at a university. Right? And you can see Milgram explains for an hour why the standards are deficient. And you know the funny thing about this? If you watch the DPI testimony, if you watch the 4 hearings in Wisconsin, we brought in people like Milgram and Stotsky. They brought in 6th grade math teachers and sophomore math teachers. And the teachers, the entire argument they kept making was, we think this is fine. We think this is fine. They read from what was almost an absolutely similar script. They were all reading the same things the same way in the same pair. So much so that the whole committee started laughing, because it became almost like one of those college drinking games. Take a shot every time you hear the word rigor, right? People were just starting to roll their eyes. And at one point, Milgram got fed up with it, because Milgram was talking, and then a 6th grade math teacher stood up and said, well, I disagree with you, Professor. I think they're fine. And Milgram said, excuse me, ma'am, and with all due respect, are you a mathematician or a math teacher? She said, I don't understand. You teach 6th grade math, and that's commendable, but are you a mathematician? Can you work with math at this level? She said, no. And he said, then with all due respect, I do. And I was in that committee. There's a difference between mathematicians and math teachers. And the mathematician, the only one they brought in, said no, 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 and explains it. Watch his testimony, right? Why? And for the Catholic school, we know why the public schools got it, because they have no choice. But then ask yourself this, these two writers say. Why? Why Catholic schools, which have a centuries-old vision of the purpose of education and a track record only the most elite secular institutions can match? Why? Why should they embrace this olive drab doctrine of uniformity and utilitarianism is not clear. In what way is this mindset compatible with Catholicism or with Catholic education? Remember what Bishop Morlino said. Remember our quote from Pope Benedict. The great Catholic educator and scholar Victorian John Henry Newman, author of the visionary book The Idea of a University, he believed that education must be directed at the whole person, not toward forming students for predetermined professional slots. Have you heard school to work? Right? That's Orwellian. And you know, one of the things that you'll hear a lot, and it's absolutely true, people say, well, but the Chamber of Commerce supports it. I've talked to, by the way, dozens of Chamber of Commerce members, and not one of them, any more than the bishops or the priests or the politicians, not one of them knows what it is. Right? In fact, every single, and I'd say it's probably been about 22 of them, or 25 of them, every single chamber person that I've given this talk to doesn't want Common Core anymore. But and if you think about what the chambers are doing, right? School to work, that's what we want. We don't really want entrepreneurs. We don't really want visionaries. We don't want people who listen to Mozart and can think through Shakespeare. We want functional people. People who are going to be skilled enough to be able to fit these slots. Right? If you're content with that in the public schools, but certainly if you're paying thousands of dollars to send your kids to private schools, is that the vision of education you want for your kid? And by the way, in order to get everybody to that drone-like place where they can fit those slots, you understand why you can't have any high achievers. In other words, if Bill Gates gets his way, there will never be another Bill Gates. And here's the funny thing about Bill Gates and about this whole scheme. People keep telling you, it's tested. Ask them to provide one shred of evidence. Ask them to name one survey or study done. Ask them to cite one country anywhere that this has been benchmarked against. They can't do it. In fact, Stotsky talked about this. One of the Senator Lehman, Democrat on the committee, asked Stotsky after an hour and a half, you say these weren't benchmarked. How do you know? And Stotsky said, I sat in the room. We asked that very question. As far as we can tell, what the committee, the people who formed the standards, what they did is they looked at some standards in other countries. They did nothing with them. They didn't test them. They didn't compare ours to them. They didn't statistically analyze them. That was the whole of benchmarking. In fact, there's only one aspect of the math curriculum that's been tried anywhere in the world, and that's how they teach geometry. 25 years of Euclidean geometry has basically been displaced now by the odd, weird way that planar geometry is being taught. There's only one other country on earth that tried it. That was the Russians. They did it for 6 months and threw it out. That, Stotsky says, is the only thing we can find internationally where there has been any attempt at this curriculum. It's all brand new. Your kids are the guinea pigs. And here's something you should Google if you doubt me on this. In the Washington Post in September of last year, Bill Gates was interviewed about Common Core, and he said, and I quote, "It would be nice to know if our education stuff works, but we won't know that for at least 10 years. 10 years, right? Phyllis Schlafly, the great education reformer, the great Roman Catholic activist, she was in on this way before I was and anybody else was. Almost a year ago now, she wrote an open letter and sent it to every single bishop in the Catholic Church. Bishop Rickett in Green Bay got that letter. It's where he got interested in Common Core. He had no idea what it was, had no idea it was in his schools. Gets Phyllis Schlafly's letter, right? And she asked the question that I've been asking you all night. One must wonder why allegedly superior academic standards, why do they necessitate such underhanded tactics? Why? Why? In her letter, she writes, as the standards began to be implemented during the 2012-2013 school year, parents noticed disturbing changes in homework, textbooks, and tests. Suddenly, Euclidean geometry was displaced. Children were instructed to add in columns from left to right. Conceptual math replaced math fundamentals. In language arts, close reading strategies forced students to read texts in a vacuum or without the encumbrance of what was deemed privileged information. I'll give you an example, one of the most famous examples. It's nationwide, right? One of the exemplar texts for Common Core English is the Gettysburg Address. And that's great. We certainly want our kids to read the Gettysburg Address, but teachers teaching the Gettysburg Address in Common Core are not to give them any background information. You're not allowed to talk about who wrote the speech. You are not allowed to mention the Civil War. You are not allowed to talk about anything that was going on around it. She's exactly right. You read texts in a vacuum. Any context or background or history or philosophy behind them, that's deemed privileged information. We don't want our kids to know that. Right? Further, this is shocking. Common Core English mandates that about 50% of classic literature, that literature that kids have read, time in memoriam for kindergarten through high school, that goes. And it's replaced with informational texts, right? And that's shocking in its own right, because every metric we have, every educational metric we have shows that kids learn how to read through storytelling. There's a reason English has been story-driven for all these years. It's because kids, particularly young kids, get excited about reading. They learn values, ethics, concepts by reading stories. Well, Common Core demotes literature by about 50% and inserts all sorts of informational texts. I'll give you some examples in a minute, but they are highly politically tendentious. Environmental Protection Agency pamphlets. Department of Energy handouts. Right? One exemplar text is an article written by President Obama for Atlantic Monthly, in which he argues that single-payer healthcare is the best way to go. There is no corresponding other side of the issue. And so kids at very young ages now are going to be reading these informational texts. Also, we also know that kids learn how to write only after they learn how to read. That the better a kid can read, the writing comes after. It's very difficult to teach a kid how to write if the kid can't read very well. Common Core, at every level of elementary school and middle school, it lowers the level of reading and dramatically raises the level of writing correspondingly. And you ask yourself, what's the point of that? Well, think about it, right? If you have kids writing who can't read well, if you have kids writing out their opinions, how about that famous lesson from the little school in Wisconsin, the Common Core third grade lesson, Hudson, Wisconsin, where kids were sent home with the following essay assignment. Write an essay on why the state is just like the family, but better. That was their assignment, right? Here's some examples. Schlafly finishes up. Catholic educators, right? And this is what we hear from our secular Catholic administrators. We're going to adapt it and adopt it. We're going to take this, already what you've seen of this curriculum, we're going to take it and we're going to just keep what we like and make the rest Catholic. How do you do that with a curriculum like this? And it's going to get worse before it, we're moving quick now, but it's going to get worse. How do you take a curriculum this flawed and Catholicize it? And why would you want to, if what you have is already superior, right? Catholic educators who propose to adapt the Common Core to the Catholic model forget the purpose of Catholic education. The mission of the Catholic school is to prepare students for eternal life, Bishop Morlino, right? And only secondarily to prepare them for temporal work. They accomplish this by pursuing truth, right? Capital truth. The idea that there is such a thing as truth. In the Common Core curriculum, that doesn't exist. You'll see in just about 2 minutes how even in math class, right answers don't matter. And by the end of it, if something as simple as math, it's more important to do the process than it is to get the right answer, then is there any subject in which truth can be allowed to breathe? In contrast, the goal of Common Core is the narrow training of students to become mere functionaries educated solely for earthly success. Catholic educators should be leery of any standards that create automatons rather than humane individuals. What is the problem with English? Well, among other things, more informational text, less classic literature. And that classic literature that's being removed, I understand why they're removing it. Because in the 21st century, why does your kid need to know what the Scarlet Letter says or need to read Romeo and Juliet? That's utterly impractical, isn't it? Have them reading computer manuals. That's one of the books, by the way, one of the recommended exemplar texts. A Bill and Melinda Gates Microsoft computer. Like when you open your computer, the little manual that helps you start it, fourth graders are suggested that fourth graders spend 3 weeks reading that every day, right? And you see how, for those, even those conservative Republicans who think the purpose of education has to be to form, right? But you're making a big mistake here, because on top of everything else that classic literature did, it also exposed kids to the great values and ethos of Western culture, the Judeo-Christian classics. It exposed them to their American heritage. Yeah, the Gettysburg Address is in there, but you can't talk about the Civil War. What's the purpose of reading the Gettysburg Address if you can't talk about Lincoln or the Civil War or the circumstances of slavery in the Union, right? Do you see how the purpose of reading is not breadth or historical knowledge or being able to plug things in? It's about, can you tell me in the most literally prosaic terms what's being said here? Right? Functional. And what do you get? With all of these informational texts, you get more indoctrination, less discussion of morality and ethics. And the thing that's so shocking, this is for English class. These are among the texts, the exemplar texts, recommended to be taught in Common Core English class. A huge majority of them have nothing to do with English. You're reading things from science, math, and tech subjects in English now. Science for freshmen and sophomores in high school. Here's a recommended one. Recommended levels of insulation. A report released in 2010 by the US EPA and the Department of Energy. If your kid makes it through that, you think your kid's going to love reading because of this? Is this going to make your kids eager to read more things? How about this? Science, Math, and Tech for grades 10 and 11. President Obama's Executive Order 13423. Strengthening federal environmental, energy, and transportation management. An essay, I've read it, on the evolution of the grocery bag. Here's a spoiler alert. They're both bad and America's destroying the planet. And that's fine. If you want them to read that stuff, that's fine. But there is no balance here. There is nothing in all this long list of informational texts that in any way, shape, or form deviates or contradicts in any small way the government position on these issues. That's politics. Right? And at young ages, kids are being exposed to this stuff.